Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for what we expect will be the first of several climate conversations with United States Senator Ron Wyden on the Inflation Reduction Act. My name is Nora Apter, and I'm the Climate Program Director for the Oregon Environmental Council. OEC is a nonprofit advocacy organization that works statewide to advance innovative, collaborative policy solutions to protect Oregon's environment and safeguard our communities and economy. OEC is very pleased to be co-hosting today's briefing with our partners, the Oregon League of Conservation Voters and Environment Oregon. We're honored to be joined today by Senator Ron Wyden, as well as several members of his staff, including Natural Resources Director Jacob Egler and Outreach Director Tim Leahy. In a few minutes, Senator Wyden will kick us off with an overview of the historic Inflation Reduction Act that was signed into law last month, and what the bill means for Oregon's climate, communities, and clean energy economy. We'll then have the opportunity to dive into some Q&A, where the senator will answer your questions on the bill. We're happy to have Senator Wyden join us for the first 30 minutes of the meeting, and then are grateful that Jacob and Tim on his staff will be able to stay for another 15 minutes at the end to answer any additional questions. Please use the Q&A function to submit your questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. And also, please be sure to stick around for the entire conversation, as we'll close with a preview of some upcoming events and additional opportunities to learn more about the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as an easy action that you can take today to thank Senator Wyden for his tremendous leadership on this bill. So before I hand it over to the senator, we're going to take a few minutes for land acknowledgement. Then I will introduce the senator, but first we will hear from Brittany with OLCV.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Brittany Van Sitters. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the organizing manager at the Oregon League of Conservation Voters. And I want to take a couple minutes to read OLCV's land acknowledgement. So the Oregon League of Conservation Voters works to protect people and places on the ancestral lands of the indigenous communities who built homes, economies, and trading routes across the land we now call Oregon. We would like to honor and acknowledge Oregon's 9 federally recognized tribes who have stewarded these lands since time immemorial. The Klamath tribe of the Southern Oregon Plateau, the Burns Paiute of the High Desert East, the Coquille of the Southern Oregon Coastal Rainforests, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde in the Northern Coast Range, the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua in the Southern Oregon Foothills, the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla in the Blue Mountains, the Confederated Tribes of Siletz in Oregon's Northern Rainforests, the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw on the wind-blown southern coasts, and the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs on the sunny eastern slopes of the Cascades. And we would like to recognize all other Indigenous communities who have not been federally recognized. Oregon was built on broken treaties. The lasting effects of federal and state policies, both past and present, have put Native Americans at a disadvantage for hundreds of years. It is on all of us, whether we are descendants of colonizers or inhabitants of stolen land, to re-educate ourselves and each other. Together, we have a responsibility to push past recognition and demand land repatriation and reparations to sovereign tribal nations and Indigenous people across this state. OLCV aims to work in partnership with tribes to further this endeavor of land repatriation and reparations.
Thank you, Brittany. And with that, I am honored to introduce our U.S. Senator Ron Wyden. Senator Wyden has represented Oregon in Congress since 1981 and has served as our U.S. Senator since 1996. And from day one, Senator Wyden has fought tirelessly to build consensus and achieve lasting, equitable, and innovative policy solutions. Senator Wyden serves on the committees on finance, budget, intelligence, and energy and natural resources. In his leadership roles as chairman of the Senate Finance Committee and as a senior member of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, Senator Wyden has successfully championed bold ideas to advance economic security, climate protections, and good-paying jobs in Oregon. And most recently, Senator Wyden led in securing clean energy tax credits and incentives and other critical provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act that will help save Oregonians money on their gas bills and electricity bills, help consumers afford clean energy technologies that will lower climate pollution and energy prices, and increase our energy security. So thanks in huge part to Senator Wyden and his team's many years of dedicated work on these and other provisions in the bill, Oregonians can now look forward to cost savings, job creations, healthier communities, and more that we will learn about today. So we are so thrilled that Senator Wyden and his staff are able to join us for this conversation on the historic Inflation Reduction Act and what this bill's unprecedented investments will mean for our state. So with that, I will hand it over to Senator Wyden for some remarks, and then we'll kick it over to Q&A.
Great. And thank you for that unquestionably inflationary introduction. And I'm going to make this a filibuster-free zone because I want to hear from members of OEC and people who are following these issues at the grassroots. And let me kind of paint the picture. After the Markey-Waxman climate plan went down in 2010, and everybody was sifting through the ashes and saying, well, we've gone for decades without a climate plan, I said, look, it's time to try something new. And I looked carefully at cap and trade. I looked at regulatory issues. I looked at issues relating to carbon pricing. And I said, while I find all of these promising, I'm not sure all the Democrats are going to go along, let alone the Republicans. And so I set about, and I was a pretty junior member of the Finance Committee then, to try to find a new path. And as I looked, I was struck by the fact that in the current tax code, there was something like 45 separate tax breaks. And most of them were a tribute to yesteryear, big old breaks for fossil fuels, and somebody knew somebody who had an oil buddy, and then they got themselves a tax break. It was the ultimate in picking winners and losers, number one. And number two, not taking the bold steps that we know are essential to reduce carbon emissions and get serious about climate change. So I began this odyssey right out of the ashes of 2010 and said, look, the tax code is allocating billions and billions of dollars each year without any regard to what it's going to take to reduce carbon emissions. And I started trying out on people across the political spectrum. Hey, everybody, how about trying a new science-driven approach? So underline science, because, you know, in the past, people might say they were for all of the above, and however you felt about the phrase, the oil crowd did really well on all of the above. So I said, let's be technologically neutral and then be science-driven. And as I started talking to some of the moderates and conservatives and the like, I said, look, if it's technology neutral, it's going to be driven by science rather than fossil fuel politics, number one. And number two, we would be able to say the more you reduce carbon emissions, the bigger your tax savings. And it is that provision that is driving groups like the Rhodium Group to say, look, they can get to a 40% reduction in emissions by the end of the decade. So I walked out of the Senate Finance Committee in early summer of 2021, and I pinched myself. And I said, did the Senate Finance Committee just actually vote what I just described to all of you? Because the Senate Finance Committee had never done anything like this in 100 years. In 100 years, it was just giving out favors, went disproportionately to the fossil crowd. And by the way, after a number of years, I started making the point, hey, everybody, do you know the fossil crowd gets their tax breaks permanent? Renewables are temporary. So right there, you saw the blatant double standard that once again made it harder for renewables to get off the ground. So we moved in the Senate Finance Committee. We started looking at ways to encourage EV production, very important. Very much like this provision, make it more attractive for younger people who might be interested in a used EV. I think that as we move to kind of questions, I tell people, I'm so grateful to Oregonians for all their input on this. They stuck with me as I pushed this for a decade. And all the political odds makers said, Ron doesn't have a shot in the world of throwing the tax code in the garbage can, which is what we did, and substituting for it what we're talking about today. So this is now what I wrote over 10 years, $260 billion in green energy tax credits and other opportunities on the equity side of the ledger and like. This $260 billion in green energy tax credits constitutes the biggest investment in climate in American history. And so I'm very proud that we've got it on the books now. We're moving to implementation. We got a lot of other things we need to do. I really want to improve transmission for green energy, which is very important. And I think Oregon could be a leader in that. But this is one where the good guys won. I mean, I think we positioned this by moving it away from just raw political power to a science-driven, technology-neutral standard, because we know renewables can compete very well in that kind of system, and then making it clear we had a very different lodestar. The more you reduce carbon emissions, the bigger your tax savings, so that we could see as Oregonians, because we've looked at all the stuff with the wildfires, no question, that's being driven to some extent, by climate change and the extraordinary heat. And now Oregon's in a position to lead. And as long as I'm chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, we're going to keep leading on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I think I can speak on behalf of the many climate, environmental justice organizations that are with us this morning. I think many of us never thought this day would come, and having that, context and just the years of history and work that went into this, we're just so enormously grateful. So happy to be able to celebrate with you here today and learn more about the incredible opportunities and benefits that the Inflation Reduction Act will bring to our state. So with that, we're going to turn it to Q&A. And I'm pleased to introduce my partners and co-hosts of today's events, Celeste Mayfern-Swango, State Director for Environment Oregon, and Lindsay Schulten, Deputy Director for the League of Conservation Voters. Thanks for joining us, Celeste and Lindsay. So we had a number of great questions come in from people around the state who submitted their thoughts and questions for the senator ahead of the event. So thank you to everybody who did that. We have a good suite of questions to kick off with, but for those of you who didn't submit questions ahead of time, it's not too late. Please feel free to use the Q&A function to submit your questions as they come to you. We'll get through as many as we have time for. I believe we have the senator for the next 15 minutes until the 30-minute mark, and then very grateful to have Tim and Jacob on staff to be able to continue with Q&A after the senator leaves for his next obligation. So I will kick us off with our first question for you, Senator, which is, which part of the Inflation Reduction Act are you most excited about? And what do you think will make the biggest difference for fighting climate change and creating clean energy jobs in Oregon?
Well, I think probably for the first time, renewables and green energy are on a level playing field with the fossil crowd. And that's why I mentioned their tax breaks literally going back 100 years. I did research on things like intangible drilling. They were like 100 years old, and stuff in the renewable space was temporary. Now we're going to have long-term certainty and predictability for green energy. And you've probably seen, I used it, Senate Majority Leader Schumer asked me to come to one of his press conferences last week and mentioned the renewable piece. And I said, look, it took us a decade to transform the tax code and turn it on its head so that renewables would finally get a fair shake. And then I said, and by the way, in the last few weeks since we passed this bill, you've seen announcements all over the country from sea to shining sea of people making commitments to invest in green energy. So these are long-term and not just temporary. And so there is a long-term runway, at least a decade, to make reducing carbon emissions the big focus of what the government is doing. And having long-term predictable certainty drives innovation, creates green energy jobs, and it's a key reason why the bill is going to reduce emissions by 40%. And whole parts of the country that have never played in the space. For example, we know that the South has not had the same kinds of focus on green energy as we have among our constituents in the Pacific Northwest. Well, Senator Warnock, Senator Ossoff really insisted that that change, and there's going to be more solar manufacturing. You now have national newspapers in small towns in Georgia talking about investments in solar manufacturing. So I think these firsts revolving around certainty, predictability, a long-term runway are going to be hugely consequential. We've never had them before.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Senator, for being here with us this morning and for all of your leadership to get this across the finish line. My question for you is, how can state and local decision makers and nonprofit organizations, like many of those here with us today, best prepare Oregon to ensure strong implementation and harness the benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act's climate and clean energy provisions?
Well, we made that a real focus because we've seen, in Oregon, the beauty of our clean energy focus is not top down, it's kind of grassroots up. And basically under our approach, everybody from the governor to nonprofits to community groups to school districts can start looking at more affordable clean energy improvements for them, whether it's new electric school buses, rooftop solar panels, and it stems from a provision that I pushed very hard for over the decade and got into the final bill. And by the way, so we're clear about it, it was hard to kind of understand what was going on in terms of the process. So for people who are following this, the Senate Finance Committee voted for our bill in early summer of 2021. The legislation then went on an incredible roller coaster ride for well over a year. And it wasn't just climate, but I wrote the prescription drug piece so that Medicare could negotiate, and the clean energy provisions that cracked down on wealthy tax cheats. We went up and down and up and down. And we thought we were about done in July. And then, as you know, Senator Manchin said he couldn't be for it. And everybody said, oh my God, we're dead. And I said, wait a minute, we're mostly done here. And by the way, the Senate Finance Committee legislation has always been 90% of what would be in the final package. And so we stayed with it. We got that 90% in the final package. And a key provision that we got would allow the state and local governments and other nonprofits full access to the full value of the clean energy tax breaks. So what that means is, basically everybody in the nonprofit sector, everybody in, local government, everybody from community activists to local officials, to school districts, to the governor, can be involved in efforts to reduce electricity costs. And I think that that's sort of the Oregon way. that's kind of the way we've always done it, is to try to figure out how to create a kind of grassroots juggernaut to involve as many people as we can. And as I developed the bill, I continued to ask questions about it in our town hall meetings. I've had 1,025 town hall meetings in my time representing Oregon in the Senate. Many Oregon Environmental Council members have come to a lot of those meetings. I'm very appreciative that they do. I sometimes call OEC activists, I call them recidivists. And I call them recidivists in the best name, because they constantly keep showing up and raising important questions about policy. And I think that helped us get some of these nuts and bolts questions resolved that you and your colleagues are asking about.
Great, thank you. I'm also going to do a quick echo of all the thanks for both being here and for all your work on this, in particular, never giving up. You talked about the roller coaster. It certainly was, but wouldn't have happened if people gave up. So thank you for not giving up. And that was always clear to us too, that you were continuing to fight for it, and it meant a lot. So obviously the impacts of climate change are, worsening. And over the last couple of years in Oregon alone, we've seen well over 100 people die from extreme wildfires, extreme heat. My question is really, how will IRA help protect people here in Oregon as we see these increasing impacts from climate change that, are hard to forget when we're continuing to live them?
Well, and I think we've all seen it, and some of this has been so heartbreaking. OEC members know my background, my shady past is I was director of the Gray Panthers for about 7 years, working with the senior citizens. And during some of these periods of extreme heat, the seniors who owned their home, this is the one thing they owned, were in a house that was so hot they couldn't breathe. And you would see it, an elderly widow, for example, pack up a little bag and go to the cooling center. Her house was quite valuable, but she didn't have a way to breathe. So that has always been a picture very much on my mind, because this extreme heat, and you mentioned 100 Oregonians over the past 2 years have died from climate-fueled extreme heat and wildfires. And I see it with the seniors, as I mentioned, the Gray Panthers. And so what we did, not just to address the underlying emissions situation, it invests the IRA in programs that directly reduce impacts from devastating wildfire, drought, and extreme heat. More than $2 billion is allocated to protect old growth and mature forests and reduce hazardous fuels, and more than $4 billion for drought relief efforts in the West, and $3 billion for environmental and climate justice block grants. And that's so important to mitigate the effects of extreme heat and urban heat islands. And a group of community leaders took me out to, Lentz one day, and it was, we live in southeast over by Reed College, but Eastmoreland's got those nice trees, so we get a little measure of cooling. And our friends and neighbors who live in Lentz don't have the same kind of situation. And I'm telling you, that really made an impression on me. And so we kept really pushing for help to get some relief for urban heat islands as well. And I think that's going to make a difference.
Thank you, Senator. I think we have time for just maybe one or two more questions. I think what is very apparent with this bill is it really has the potential to offer benefits to Oregonians across all four corners of our state. And we had a number of questions come in around how the Inflation Reduction Act will benefit Oregon's farmers and ranchers, in part by increasing carbon sequestration, and addressing the impacts of climate change on agriculture and our natural resource economy. Could you say a little bit more about some of those benefits?
Yeah, I really zeroed in on the farmers and ranchers. The IRA invests billions in programs and incentives to help farmers and ranchers mitigate climate change harm to their operations. while undertaking various kinds of innovative and voluntary conservation efforts that's going to improve their farms for today and for the future. There's $20 billion invested in existing natural resource conservation service programs that enhance water and soil and wildlife habitat. We're talking about the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, the Regional Conservation Partnership, and others. And then there's billions for new programs to support underserved farmers, ranchers, and forest landowners who are feeling the worst impact of the climate crisis. And in the Farm Bill, the last Farm Bill, I was able to get some help for farmers in the conservation area, and I'm going to push that in the next Farm Bill as well.
Great. And I think I have the final question, Senator. Were there any climate or environmental priorities that were not included in the Inflation Reduction Act that you are eager for Congress to consider and act on?
Well, the transmission issue, I still want to find smart policies consistent with the environmental laws that get clean power to our communities. And Oregon's in better shape than some in terms of transmission, but we still got a long way to go to fill in the gaps. That was probably when I said we got 90% of our bill that passed in early summer of 2021 in the final package was all the dramatics and Senator Schumer and Senator Manchin and the president and all this kind of stuff. We got 90% of what we had worked on for a decade in that. And so that was very satisfying. There's more to do in terms of transmission. And, I continue to believe that there are a number of sectors where we can speed up and expand some of the services, particularly in EJ. I mean, environmental justice is so important. We made some significant steps, some of which I've touched on here. There's a lot more to do in the environmental justice area as well. In Oregon, we've said, when people are hurting, everybody is hurting because it diminishes what we're all about as Oregonians, because we've always said we're in this together, particularly on the environment. So I think that probably would be it. And we just want to get solar and wind and geothermal. We just want to get all of these renewables and heat pumps and all the solar panels and everything that is out there, both for businesses and homeowners. And we just want to get it up and going as fast as we can. And my goal, so everybody knows, is I want to do better than the 40% target for coming up. And I just have a long closing address. And if the chairman of a committee says they're going to give you a closing address, you should head for the hills or go to the kitchen, get yourself a tea or something like that. My closing address is just thank you, thank you. I've worked with the Oregon Environmental Council throughout my time in public service. You all give public service a really good name, and volunteering and grassroots and participating in these issues. And there were a lot of times when you all bucked me up over this last decade, because I remember a bunch of lobbyists apparently, when I started working on this, had a bet. And how many said, how many of you think Ron Wyden can throw the tax code in the garbage can and go do this thing? And nobody, everybody said there is not a prayer that Ron is going to be able to come up with something that these lobbyists aren't going to blow out of the water, right away. And we said, no, we said, we feel that people understand now's the time when we got to make some real changes. So my closing address is just thank you, thank you. And the Oregon way is to get as far as you can in this battle, and then we'll move on. And I want everybody to know I'll be partnering with you all the rest of the way. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you
so much,
Thank
Senator.
you.
Bye, guys.
Appreciate your time. All right, so we will now continue with the Q&A, and we're pleased to be joined by Jacob and Tim on Senator Wyden's staff. So I'll welcome you both to the virtual stage. Thank you both for being here today. I am going to just continue going through these questions. So the next one that we have for you both, and the senator was touching on this a little bit in his closing remarks in response to the last question, but what can you tell us about provisions in this bill that will benefit Oregon's tribes, low-income communities, and people of color? And what do you see as the biggest opportunities in the bill, but also in the future to advance environmental and economic justice?
Yep. So Jacob, I don't know if he's able to join here too, but I'll defer to him. But I know that obviously the excuse me, equity is a major focus on this legislation. There's direct grant programs to help frontline communities. Ron fought for bigger incentives for renewable energy projects that serve low-income communities. Solar arrays, rooftop solar that serve affordable housing complexes and communities, just to name a few. I don't know if Jacob wants to pile on to anything there, but as I think with not just from the, you heard Ron talking about the Lentz community and how important it is that we're recognizing that the impacts of climate change disproportionately affect communities of color and underserved communities. It was a major focus of this bill, and will continue to be moving forward.
Yeah, and just to add to what Tim said, I think the senator had mentioned, some of the new programs that were created, for example, for underserved farmers. There are also programs that were included, funding that was included for things like the environmental and climate justice block grants that can be used to mitigate some of those effects that we're seeing, such as extreme heat and urban heat islands. In addition, this legislation isn't done in a vacuum, and there were also over the past couple of years, making sure that we were making investments in these communities was a high priority too, as we were looking at some of the other legislation, some of the COVID relief packages, et cetera. And so we're going to be continuing to look, as the senator mentioned, at opportunities going forward. He specifically mentioned the Farm Bill, but we'll be looking at every other opportunity to continue to advance these policies and make these types of investments to build on what we've done here in the Inflation Reduction Act.
Great, thank you both. And we've heard a bit about this as well, but hoping we can dig in a little bit more. This question is about opportunities to build Oregon's economy and job creation. So what do you see as the greatest opportunities in the bill for building Oregon's clean energy economy and green job creation? And I would just add to that, if there's anything that you can foresee that Oregon decision makers, companies, advocates that are here today can do to best position our state to harness those opportunities, would love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, so I think as we sort of kicked off talking about that we've historically had this disparity when we're talking about incentives for renewable energy. And so as we look to continue to build clean renewable energy for the future, I think the certainty that we now have in place, we'd long heard that that the technology has gotten to the point where it's not only competitive in many cases, it's the most cost effective, assuming that you are not disincentivizing that by having inequities in terms of incentives for fossil fuel versus clean energy. Now that we have kind of fixed that, now that we have some of these permanent incentives in place, we're in a position where, in large part, those decision makers and the private sector are in a position to use that certainty to make these investments in a way that I don't think they could in the past. So I think that's going to be a real opportunity. And I think when folks look at just making these decisions and they look at the sort of the bottom line now that we have, these new policies in place, I think in many cases, the decision is going to make itself when you look at what is cost effective and what makes the most sense for communities.
And to kind of put a fine point on that too, I think, you know, we have companies here in Oregon. There's a long-term battery energy storage company, for example, called ESS, and it's exciting to see companies like that articulate to us how important it is for them to be able to count on exactly what Jacob was just talking about. You know, every single year, Ron always makes this joke about the tax credits being, sometimes these tax credits have a shorter shelf life than a carton of eggs. And you know, it's always in the 11th hour, and, you know, it's like Christmas Eve or something, and there's a bill going through the Senate to extend a wind energy tax credit, or the solar tax credit, or whatever the case may be. And that's no longer the case. And again, companies here in Oregon right now are going to be growing their workforce and expanding because of that certainty.
Thank you both. So this one is a sector-specific question around buildings, and we've heard the senator talk about, you know, climate impacts, just ever worsening extreme heat, wildfire smoke. So we know buildings are the second largest source of climate pollution in Oregon, but as well as our first line of defense against climate extremes. How will the clean energy tax incentives and rebates in the bill help Oregon families make their homes more resilient and efficient while saving money on energy bills?
I'll start and try and tackle that one. So, you know, there, as part of kind of the some of those tax policies that we were just talking about, there's also tax credits and rebates for families as they relate to heating and cooling for efficiency. You know, I think, for example, families can save up to $2,000 off a new heat pump as a result of these credits and rebates. And so it's that kind of improvement to policies that will allow families to not only see the benefit of reducing the cost of their bills, but also reduce the contribution to this climate crisis that we're in.
Thank you, Jacob. Tim, anything to add to that one?
Nothing other than just a personal anecdote that I'm sure a lot of folks on this call are going to also experience of, you know, getting right now, if you go and get an estimate for a heat pump to have installed in your house, which we did recently, it's completely cost prohibitive, or it's not completely cost prohibitive, but it was a cost prohibitive for most of the families probably on this call, and many of the families that we certainly want to make sure are benefiting from the IRA. You know, going back to the call about, or the question about underserved communities, you know, like the ones in Lentz, for example, you know, those families can't currently afford many of the ticket price for some of these technologies that are integral not only to reducing carbon, but to saving lives. And we think that this bill is going to get at some of those problems.
Yeah, I'm sure many folks on the call can relate to that. And we know that efficient appliances like heat pumps are such a key part of the climate solution. So just so excited for these rebates and incentives to start becoming made available and getting them into the hands of Oregonians.
You know, and sorry, just one other piece on that too. I know that there's also commercial building incentives as well. So I mean, you know, we talk a lot about the residential side, which is obviously huge. But again, kind of going back to Jacob's comments about the certainty and investment in these energies, these technologies, starting in 2022, for example. We can put some of these the specifics in the chat or follow up with folks, but because it gets pretty wonky pretty fast about what's available out there for the commercial side. But that was another huge focus that was part of the bill.
That is a great flag. Thank you, Tim. All right, next question. Do you think natural climate solutions like protecting mature and old growth forests have an important role to play alongside the technological solutions in the Inflation Reduction Act?
Yeah, absolutely. Senator Wyden has a long history of working on many of these conservation issues, whether it is protecting Oregon's most treasured places, or looking for ways to continue with policies that protect mature and old growth forests, and also responsibly reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire to community and to those resources. It's something that we have weighed in with the administration about, desired to see, pleased to see the administration taking steps to inventory and look to conserve those resources for the future. And it's something that we're going to be continued focused on. There are a number of places around the state where we have current, efforts to increase our ability to protect these resources in the face of climate change. One example that comes to mind is the River Democracy Act, which would conserve, many of the rivers around the state that are seeing impacts as a result of a changing climate. And those rivers are rivers that provide clean drinking water to our communities, recreation opportunities, but they're also areas that are necessary to help protect a healthy and resilient landscape. And so it's a top priority to move forward those policies that are going to continue to protect these resources for generations to come.
Thank you, Jacob. Tim, anything you want to add there?
Not other than just underscore the importance that I think we all wholeheartedly agree. I mean, once those trees are gone, they're gone forever, and I think we all recognize the importance of that.
Thank you. All right. I think we have time for maybe just one or maybe two more questions, and then we know that Tim and Jacob have to get on to their next obligation. So I'm pulling up one. This is about kind of, how are we closing the gap? And Senator Wyden talked about wanting to move on beyond the 40% emissions reductions that are estimated to be achieved through the Inflation Reduction Act. So this question is, since it seems increasingly unlikely that we will be unable to keep temperature increases between 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade, what are your thoughts about enhancing community resilience in the face of weather and social disruptions Oregonians will encounter in the coming decades? And there's another question that I think is somewhat related, if you have time to respond to both, which is, what's kind of the plan to close the gap from the 40% emissions reductions expected from the IRA to the 50% reductions that we know the best available science says will be necessary to achieve by 2030 to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So both focusing on kind of resilience, how are we making sure that we're protecting Oregon communities and ensuring we're able to adapt to climate impacts, and also how will we close the gap?
Yeah, so I guess starting with kind of that second question of how we're going to go about closing the gap, I think there are a number of kind of legislative proposals that we currently have that we're trying to advance that we think start to get after this, and they're going to be top priorities for the senator. We've got a grasslands bill that works to help ensure that these areas can continue to sequester carbon. We often talk about our forests, but they're a critical piece too as well. There are a number of other proposals that we're looking at to incentivize our agricultural communities to adopt practices that are ensuring healthy soils that can help sequester carbon. And I think we're going to be looking going forward at additional opportunities to build off of what was in the Inflation Reduction Act. Now we're already seeing, as we noted, some of these really harmful impacts to communities that are taking lives, that are putting communities at risk. And so in the face of those, we are actively making investments in infrastructure to build more resilient infrastructure in the state. And we are looking at ways to mitigate risks, for example, wildfire risks to communities. And I mentioned earlier, looking at doing that in a responsible way. So we've got, a prescribed fire bill that the senator is working to advance that, we think balances the need to continue to get at some of the hazardous fuels buildup that we've seen as a result of generations of fire suppression, getting away from kind of a historic fire regime, while ensuring that we're protecting mature and old growth forests that are also at risk from catastrophic wildfires. And, I think everyone in the state has seen, the result of that over, the past few years. And it's a cycle that we want to break, because it's devastating to communities, but it's also terrible from a larger environmental standpoint. So.
And just to put a couple dollars on that, because and more than a couple dollars, to be specific, $3 billion, for example. I mean, there's a lot in this bill. One, we all know that. But there's environmental and climate justice block grants for doing some of the things we were just talking about. So $3 billion, 2.8 billion of the $3 billion is for grants to support things like mitigating climate health risks from urban heat islands, extreme heat, wood heater emissions, wildfire events, exactly what Jacob was talking about, pollution monitoring. A different 50 million that's not included in that 3 billion is going to be going towards funding to address air pollution at schools, so that we can monitor and figure out what exactly we're dealing with. I mean, we've ignored so many of these problems for so many years. And finally, we have something that's going to be providing not only concrete action moving forward on what the technologies are going to my kids are going to need to mitigate and to finally put a curb on climate change, but also to really kind of understand where are we at. So there's a lot in this bill. I know in the some folks have asked, where can I go to better understand the all the different pieces are in the bill. A good starting point I always refer people to is cleanenergy.gov, which is a website launched by the White House. If you haven't checked that out, that will supply some of the basic information that you'll need to understand how some of the programs you might be able to take advantage of, but also some of these really important programs that aren't always in the kind of top headlines of the stories, like making sure we can understand the air pollution in our schools.
Thank you, Tim. And I just dropped a link to that White House website that you just mentioned in the chat for folks who are looking for resources and more ways to learn about the bill. I think that's a great starting point as well. All right. Well, I want to thank you both so much for taking time to join us today and answer our audience questions. We hope that everybody who is on the call today will join us in showing appreciation for Senator Wyden's tremendous leadership on this historic climate bill by retweeting or commenting on this tweet that we're going to drop in the chat. Just an easy way to show some gratitude for this enormous and historic climate bill. I'm also going to hand it over to Celeste to share information on another near-term opportunity to learn more about the Inflation Reduction Act, and then we'll be wrapping up shortly.
Thanks, Nora. Yeah, I just wanted to, I put this in the chat, but Environment America, U.S. PIRG Education Fund, and Rewiring America are hosting an event next Wednesday at noon Pacific called Electrifying Your Home. So we're actually going to walk through more information about what heat pumps are, heat pump water heaters, induction stoves, and some of the incentives that are available through the Inflation Reduction Act. So if you've been thinking about making the transition in your own home, I definitely encourage you to join that webinar. We'll also have homeowners from across the country who have recently adopted those clean technologies on to just answer questions about the process and their experience. So I think you'll get a lot out of it. I'll put the link in the chat again, but hopefully y'all can join us.
Thank you, Celeste. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we expect this will be the first of several climate conversations with Senator Wyden on the Inflation Reduction Act. So please stay tuned for more information on future events as they get scheduled. And thank you all so much again for joining us today.